Hello, everybody. Just like all my live streams, this one is going to be a little bit of a rough start again. Just want to make sure everything's working. Um, so bear with me for a second. Okay. It says live stream offline. Hold on a second. Looks like I'm on a really big delay. So if you guys ask a question in here, give me, I don't know, 45 seconds to respond. Delay. So if you guys ask a question in here, okay, so we're live, people. If you have anything to say in the chat, feel free to ask any questions now. But I just want to wish everybody a very happy 9/11. Um, and yeah, I hope everybody's having a good day. Um, yeah, the reason I wanted to do this today is because we sort of already figured out our quota for the month of September from Media Roots. We already have a bunch of interviews and other things in the can. We already have a review of the Magnitsky Act behind the scenes documentary, which is coming out probably the second to last episode of September. And then we have an interview about situation in Nicaragua right now that's coming out in September as well. So I wanted to use this opportunity to just speak only about 9/11 and, you know, any surrounding facets having to do with 9/11. Thanks, Pierce. So yeah, good to see you guys in here. Some familiar faces. And yeah, I guess John Gold is talking about my receding hairline already in the chat, so that's pretty cool. Thanks, John. So I guess I just wanted to maybe start the episode with giving people a little bit of information about what kind of 9/11 books or movies or stories that have really shaped sort of my worldview and my how I look at 9/11. Um, Something that John Gold has taught me over the years is that um, approaching it with the mindset of we don't know what happened and we don't necessarily know who's involved um, is sort of where I am now. But I don't, in the sense that I mean, I couldn't prove to you who I think was involved in 9/11 or exactly what happened. But after all the books I've read, after all the movies that I've watched, the research that I've done, there are some huge gaping holes that you can poke in the official story. And then there's some areas of speculation that I believe are also very important. But whether we can prove certain things or not, I'm not going to focus on that as much today because, I guess let me just say that I find it annoying that there are a lot of mainstream journalists out there who approach the world of 9/11 truth with this complete sort of disdain for it. Meaning that I would be willing to bet most mainstream journalists, even ones who have done important stories about 9/11 or that have poked holes in the 9/11 official story, haven't read, a lot of stuff or seen stuff that's considered truther. And I find that unfortunate because I think that there's valuable stuff in the sort of careful journalistic approach to 9/11, and there's also very valuable stuff in the more speculative, taking leaps world when it comes to 9/11. It's such a big event that it really is impossible to explain the entire event. So if anybody out there is just starting looking at this kind of stuff, I would, try to narrow it down. And there are some areas that people have narrowed things down to, which I think have caused a lot of people to run in circles and aren't necessarily the best focuses. One of those things is like Pilots for 9/11 Truth, the whole thing about what happened at the Pentagon. Did a missile hit it? Did a plane hit it? There's sort of become a pushback in the 9/11 Truth movement with a lot of the more old school members of the movement who are actually debunking the idea that anything but a plane hit it. For example, Ken Jenkins made a documentary all about how he believes truthers got it wrong on the Pentagon and how actually there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a plane did hit it. So, there's a lot of internal debates still going on in the 9/11 Truth movement. The one that I get bombarded by the most, probably, people who are very aggressive about it, are a lot of these sort of Israel did 9/11 truthers, who everything to them gravitates around this idea that the Mossad was behind it. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But the way I prefer to look at 9/11 is I take in all different types of information. So I don't latch on to one theory or another necessarily. For example, the idea that Saudi Arabia did 9/11 and they're responsible for it. I don't subscribe to that theory, although that theory has somehow become very popular and widely accepted among the far left. So, I think there are kernels of truth to that theory. There was definitely Saudi royalty involvement, Saudi funding. We already know that the majority of the hijackers were actually Saudi. So there is truth to that narrative. However, I think to have that define everything is short-sighted, and also you're not taking in a lot of other information as well. And one of the things that was recently discussed on Media Roots Radio in my interview with John Duffy and Ray Novoselsky was this idea that there was this really perfect opportunity to stop 9/11. where the CIA's Alex station was actually tracking the movements of two not future 9/11 hijackers um, during the process of them getting visas, coming into the United States, staying in San Diego, taking flying lessons, and then buying plane tickets and boarding planes. So this is just one small example of how the CIA could have stopped 9/11 fairly easily, actually, if you really look at all the details laid out, but chose not to. And then later very strongly lied about why they chose not to. This was actually mentioned only in a footnote of the 9/11 Commission report, even though Thomas Keane, said that it was one of the most troubling and glaring examples of how a federal agency lied about the attacks and tried to minimize their own role. So the one of the authors of the 9/11 report, co-authors, actually has admitted that footnote 44, as John Gold just mentioned, thanks for reminding me what it was to him the most upsetting part of the whole 9/11 Commission hearing, or the investigation that they allegedly conducted. That's an interesting statement by him, because he's the one who co-authored the report and decided not to put it in the actual report. So that's something that's become widely known. It's accepted in sort of the mainstream narrative of 9/11 now, but it's not really getting very much traction. And Richard Clarke, of course, has explained this by saying that, well, the only reason why this information would have been blocked from me and a bunch of other people in the FBI and even the White House, he alleges, is because the CIA was trying to recruit two of these hijackers as informants, to have informants inside Al-Qaeda. So I don't personally believe that theory holds water. But it's Richard Clarke's only explanation for why he thinks the CIA didn't stop it. And John, if you could do me a favor and post that section from your Paul Thompson interview, I wanted to read that, actually, because Paul Thompson is one of the people who Ray and John's movie 9/11 Press for Truth is based off of his work to some extent. And Paul Thompson believes that Richard Clarke's theory just doesn't make sense. Now, of anyone who could be an authority on all this and have all this information laid out, or an encyclopedic knowledge of it in their own mind, Paul Thompson, to me, is one of the premier authorities on in terms of 9/11 knowledge and the amount of information that he has. So I guess John didn't hear me. I'm going to ask him to post this because I wanted to read this to you. So this is sort of one of the more recent revelations about 9/11. But one of the most interesting parts of Ray and John's book. Hold on a second. So I thought one of the most interesting parts of Ray and John's book had to do with this specific story and different things having to do with it, such as I'm still waiting for this link from John. Send me a message when you can, John. So back to what I was saying. Sorry for getting distracted there. One of the most interesting things in Ray and John's book is not only did the CIA cover up and hide the fact that they knew, apparently up to 50 agents at the Alex station knew about the presence of these two Al-Qaeda operatives inside the United States. To sort of hide this, that they knew this, they actually created a fake paper trail and made it appear that they had sent the information off to the FBI. And this obviously shows a deliberate attempt to cover up what's arguably their role in 9/11, because this opportunity to foil the plot seemed like it was just handed to them sort of on a silver platter, and they chose not to do it. And they also chose to lie to other government agencies and create a fake paper trail to make it appear that they actually reported on this to other government agencies earlier, when in fact they had not. Richard Clarke actually says that if they had come to them, if they had spread that information and given it to people in the FBI or other government agencies as early as, or as late as like 9/10 or 9/09/01, then they would have been able to stop the entire plot. So just let that sink in for a second, that somehow, and we always hear that, oh, people were given raises, they were given promotions, nobody was held accountable. But you often don't know the actual details of who those people were who were given raises and who were not held accountable. One of those people, his name is Rich Blee, and he was actually the head of CIA's Alex station after Michael Scheuer, and he is directly named by Kevin Fenton in his book Disconnecting the Dots as someone who was responsible for this. And of course later Richard Clarke also talks about him in the interview that was conducted by Ray and John. So I guess John couldn't find that link, but it's actually in a section of John's book, We Were Lied to About 9/11, in the Paul Thompson interview section. Paul Thompson just sort of discusses the ludicrousness of Richard Clarke's theory and how it just doesn't hold water as to why the CIA withheld this information. Because when were they planning on foiling the plot? So if they were going to put informants inside Al-Qaeda, when were they planning to stop the plot? Because just because you're trying to recruit somebody as informants doesn't take away your ability to monitor a plot in progress and stop it. So even if that was true, that the CIA was trying to recruit Al-Qaeda agents or informants, it still doesn't explain why they weren't able to stop the attack. Because, if the CIA was concerned about stopping or preventing some kind of terrorist attack, you would think they could have done it on top of their attempts to recruit informants. So let me answer the first super chat question here. So Joseph Ballin asks, Robbie, can you talk about the psychological effects on 9/11 on kids like me who watched it happen in elementary school, along with the dancing Palestinians footage that day? Yes, I can talk about that. Let me just make sure I get your whole question, because I think you updated it. Hold on, Joseph. Oh, got it. Okay. You meant the footage of the Palestinians celebrating in Palestine. Well, it's a good question, Joseph. Obviously, 9/11 had a devastating psychological impact on everybody, especially those people who are watching TV, who lived in the U.S. at the time. And I was already, I want to say 20 years old by the time 9/11 happened. So, I mean, I could just remember my own trauma from that day was extremely intense. I was in a heightened state. I had a lot of questions, I remember initially, that seemed oddly not answered in this rush to war. So I remember being really traumatized and affected psychologically by the attack itself. But then I was immediately traumatized by this sort of rush to war, and that we needed to do something to retaliate against whoever did this. And the talk about bin Laden, of course, started very quickly, and the idea that we should invade Afghanistan became sort of a common talking point you would hear on the news within, I think, a 48-hour period from 9/11. So I remember going very quickly to being traumatized by the attack itself, to being traumatized by the rush to war afterwards. And also just being confused about the lack of evidence being presented to us and things like that. Now, Joseph asked about the dancing Palestinians celebrating in Palestine. Let me just walk you through a little bit, like my actual experience on that day. So I got a phone call from my mom. I think it was like at 9 in the morning, maybe even like 8 in the morning, because I'm on Pacific time. So probably actually even earlier than that. One of the very first things I asked my mom after she told me that there was some kind of terrorist attack happening in New York was, who's responsible? Who are they saying did this? You know, because they're already saying it's a terrorist attack. There was already 2 plane crashes, so, you know, it seemed like it wasn't an accident anymore at that point. And my mom said, they're saying it's Palestinian terrorists. I remember thinking, oh, that's really strange, you know. Why would they do this? How did Palestinian terrorists pull this off? You know, was my initial thought. Now, at about, I think it was maybe 12:30 p.m. that day, they actually started airing footage on the news of Palestinians in Palestine celebrating the attacks, allegedly celebrating the attacks. This footage was aired on all the major networks at the same exact time, which is a very strange thing to do. I still want to know who made those decisions at those news agencies to run with that footage, because, yeah, while it is visceral and sensationalist and it's going to make a lot of people upset, it still doesn't make sense why it was newsworthy enough to run it in the middle of a national emergency, while people were still looking for their loved ones in the dust and in these collapsed towers. That never made sense to me. But if you want to just take a little bit of a leap, what does make sense to me is that the news media and forces in the United States were very determined to frame Palestinians for the attacks before the bin Laden narrative set in. I'm just reading over some of the other questions. And you can actually go back and listen to a Media Roots radio podcast I did called Donald Trump and the Palestinian Frame-Up. There was stuff that Donald Trump said on the campaign trail about Muslims celebrating the 9/11 attacks, thousands of them. In my podcast, I discussed that he's actually mixing together 2 real events and distorting them and creating a false memory. One of the events was the 4 suspected Israeli spies that were apparently filming the collapse of the World Trade Center from New Jersey, from a parking lot. These men were seen celebrating. They had the police called on them. The person who called the police believed they were Middle Eastern. They were Israeli. And the other thing that Donald Trump was mixing together was this footage that I'm talking about that was aired on television showing Palestinians allegedly celebrating the 9/11 attacks. The incident with the Israelis actually did happen. That's proven. It's documented. It actually happened. The incident with Palestinians dancing in Palestinian territories on 9/11 as celebration of the 9/11 attacks, we have no proof that actually happened. The footage that was shown on television was shown out of context. There's mixed reports about what that footage was actually showing. Reuters claims that they happened to be there already, and they started filming this right after the 9/11 attacks. A German investigative report was conducted by a German news team who actually interviewed one of the women photographed in the video footage, an older woman, who says that the Reuters camera crew actually bribed them with food and candy and told them to essentially stage this scene. So that's actually something you can look up online. The German investigative report was done by a credible person. It didn't get very much play at all. Of course, no news agencies ever retracted this. Marty O asked a question that I don't understand. So, Marty, maybe you can clarify this. He asked, can you talk about the avant-garde outfit gelatin? Cardboard boxes, wallpaper to walk in, photo had code for electrolyte. I'm not sure. I'm a little lost with your question. Give me a little bit more information if you can. Well, Sandra C. says, I can't really understand why Palestinians would celebrate this anyways. Doesn't make sense. Well, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Most Palestinians, even the ones who want to see Israel destroyed, which is not the majority of them, have much more animosity towards Israel than they do against the United States. The organization with a lot of animosity towards the United States was Al-Qaeda, partly because of our support for Israel. However, a lot of Palestinians, I wouldn't say that they have that much animosity towards the United States. I don't think that they have the time or the luxury to really focus on the United States that much. So to just believe that they would be celebrating the 9/11 attacks because they were so happy that this many Americans died, I think is a hard pill to swallow, and, just on face value. So that being said, it's very interesting that footage was aired. And that's not the only example either of attempts to frame Palestinians for the 9/11 attacks. If you go listen to my episode, The Palestinian Frame Up, for Media Roots, I go into detail about how there were at least 5 incidences throughout the day that the media was broadcasting that seemed like attempts to frame Palestinians for the attacks and to place blame on Palestinian terrorist groups. Within literally seconds of the Pentagon being hit, and you could verify this on the WikiLeaks leaked 9/11 pager intercepts. Within seconds of the Pentagon being hit, a report came out on multiple TV news channels, mainstream TV news channels, saying that a Palestinian organization called the DFLP had just claimed credit for the attacks, had just taken credit for them. Of course, this is an unverified claim. Anyone could have called in to the allegedly the Arab TV station that was called in to take credit for the attacks. But yet NBC News and all these other news agencies, including Tom Brokaw, ran with it anyways. That was actually the earliest claim of responsibility by U.S. media, was that Palestinian terrorist groups were responsible for this, specifically the DFLP. Later in the day, anonymous FBI sources were telling the media that the fourth plane crashed into Camp David. And the same FBI informants were apparently going around the media saying that the significance of the date, 9/11, was in response to an anniversary of the Oslo Peace Accords, the Camp David Peace Accords, that were done in a weekend or over the course of a week in September. Now, both of these things turned out not to be true. The fourth plane did not crash into Camp David, and 9/11 was not the anniversary of the Camp David Peace Accord signing. So you have to wonder, why would an anonymous FBI official be feeding this information to the media when it could be very easily, instantly verified to be false? Not so much the early reporting about the plane crashing into Camp David, but the two linked together. Think of these two things. First, saying that this was the anniversary of the Camp David Peace Accords, which implies, again, that it's Palestinians who somehow were behind it. And secondly, saying that the fourth plane actually crashed into Camp David. Both sort of insinuate that Palestinians were behind the attacks. So these were three major incidents that happened throughout the day that the mainstream media reported that appeared to place blame on Palestinians. My research has only gone as far as laying out the chronology for this media propaganda to blame Palestinians for the attacks. I haven't gone as far as trying to figure out, I have tried to figure out, but I haven't found any evidence or proof of if there was any coordination behind this media blast to frame Palestinians. I think it seems quite obvious that there was coordination, that someone was coordinating this narrative, but I can't prove it. I can't show you, who is pulling the strings. So, that's what I mean by the speculative realm. As a 9/11 researcher at this point, I mostly stick with things that I can prove and show you interesting new angles of 9/11 just based on things that I can prove. I speculate a lot less than I used to about what these things mean and who's behind them. You can take a stab in the dark about who would be mainly interested in framing Palestinians for the attacks. The answer's fairly obvious. Neocon groups in this country, there's a lot of crossover with Zionism and people who are staunchly pro-Israel. So, some of those people may have been involved in coordinating that narrative. But again, I can't prove that. I have no evidence of that. The only evidence I really have that any neocons were really intent on blaming Palestine for the attacks or blaming Palestinian groups is that Donald Kagan and Fred Kagan of the Kagan family, members of Project for the New American Century, they both went on the radio on 9/12, the day after 9/11, and told the host that it essentially doesn't really matter who is behind the attacks. Even if bin Laden wasn't behind the attacks, we should go take out Al-Qaeda anyways. We should go take out Iraq. We should go take out Afghanistan. And they said that we should go take out Arafat's regime in Palestinian territories and clean it out. Clean out the region. It's kind of code for genocide. Just killing a bunch of Muslim and Arab people in Palestine as a retaliation for 9/11. As far as I know, they were the only two people who went on record and continued pushing this framing that Palestinians are to blame. Even though they didn't say that directly, they don't say that Palestinians are behind the attacks. They just say that we should retaliate against the Palestinians for 9/11. And what's very interesting to me about that is that the Bush administration never ran with that at all. At least officially, from what we know. The Bush administration, even internally, what's come out in tell-all books and all this stuff about 9/11 after the fact, we know that the Bush administration was pretty intent on blaming not just bin Laden, but somehow tying Saddam Hussein in Iraq to bin Laden very quickly out of the gates. What's missing from that is they didn't say anything about Palestinians, Palestine, Arafat, the PLO, the DFLP. They never said anything about that. So that is intriguing that the media was trying to push that narrative, but the Bush administration didn't pick it up. What does that mean? We're always under this impression that the Bush administration was, that Cheney was pushing the lever of the detonator on the buildings, and they set everything up, and they all had cover stories, and Bush was waiting for the attacks to happen, and that's why he reacted so weirdly at the school and all this stuff. But I think that what I've just talked about reveals a very interesting split in how it appears that there were forces in the United States trying to push a completely alternative script as to who did 9/11 than the Bush administration was trying to push, and that it was dropped, and that certain neocons who had lines into the Bush administrations, very specific ones, were still trying to push this narrative the day after, and then they dropped it too. I just find that really fascinating. So, a lot of people out there think this might be just like an obscure getting into the weeds about 9/11. What does it matter? For me personally, it's one of the most interesting aspects of 9/11. And it's one of the only things that I've put together through my original research that other people have not done. There's a lot of researchers out there who have covered in pretty great detail pretty much any other aspect of 9/11 except for this one. So, yeah, I don't mean to brag about that. I'm just saying that it's, it's one of the only areas that I've really strongly researched myself and, come to some interesting conclusions on. One of the other areas of research that I find really interesting is Rudy Giuliani and 9/11. And not just 9/11 and his role in anthrax cleanup. Rudy Giuliani made millions of dollars off of anthrax cleanup after the anthrax attacks. One of the other interesting aspects of Rudy Giuliani is he appears to be some kind of deep state player, even going back as far as being in the Reagan administration. That it appears that his job was to flub and punt several important prosecutions, including even of mobsters. And in several of these instances, his prosecutions were actually overturned. Now, author Kevin Ryan, in his book Another 19, raises the question, was this sort of Rudy Giuliani's role? It's possible that his role was to sort of drop the ball on these investigations that he was assigned to do as prosecutor. But I'm going to read to you a few sections from his book in a second about Rudy Giuliani, because I think that Rudy Giuliani is one of the most interesting characters in all of this. Very few players, or 9/11 suspects, if you want to call them, have such deep connections to both the 9/11 attacks and the anthrax attacks. And I'll explain to you what I mean in a little bit. But if you were to make a list of people who had suspicious connections to both attacks and the subsequent cover-ups to both attacks, Rudy Giuliani goes all the way to the top of the list. There is no one in the Bush administration, in federal government, in private industry, no one that has this many ties to both events. And so, yeah, as Bird World, this just says Rudy is Trump's lawyer. So that's very fascinating because a lot of 9/11 truthers, idiotic ones, I will say, because there's a difference between, in my opinion, smart truthers and stupid ones. A lot of the stupid ones actually believed that Trump was a secret truther. And because Roger Stone was dropping all these seeds on Alex Jones show saying that Trump thinks something's hinky about 9/11 and he's gonna blow it open if he gets elected. I mean, that should have been obvious that was a complete lie from the very beginning, and that it was sort of conspiracy. I wouldn't even call it dog whistling. It's conspiracy movement baiting. Trump actually did a smart strategy to try to get the conspiracy vote. He succeeded in that. But you know, if you were a believer of that narrative before, you shouldn't be now after Trump has hired Rudy Giuliani to be his lawyer, because of the reasons I just mentioned. And I'll give you more examples in a second. Terrorsaur01 has an interesting question. This is actually something I was considering talking about today. Actually, in a weird way, I was considering spending most of my time talking about this. So I'm glad I noticed this question. Terrorsaur01 says, is it too much navel gazing to want to dissect the 9/11 truth movement and what went wrong? This is the big question for me. Evidence of lies exists, but the push to make people aware failed overall. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, yeah, maybe it's navel gazing, maybe it's getting into the weeds too much, maybe it's inside baseball. But I think it's safe to assume that most people in this chat right now, in this channel, are pretty aware of the 9/11 truth movement and sort of the history of it, and maybe some of the players involved in it. So I'm going to do two things right now. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time and I know this is a sloppy live stream. I apologize for this. I didn't plan out the order of how I was going to do this, but Pierce Redmond wants me to talk about some of the phone calls from the planes. Yes, I will talk about that. So, things on my agenda for today that I'm going to definitely address. Pierce's question about the phone calls. Dissecting the movement itself, what went wrong. I'm going to go into Rudy Giuliani pretty deeply. I'm going to read some sections from Kevin Ryan's book about Rudy Giuliani. And I guess we could probably figure out more things from there if you guys want to ask more questions. But first, let me start with what went wrong in the 9/11 truth movement. I think, if I'm being honest, it was doomed to fail from the very beginning. And I probably wouldn't have thought that back then. I was very idealistic about it. I thought that this movement was going to uncover the attacks, was going to, change the country, was going to make a bunch of people wake up to the fascism, post 9/11 fascism of the United States. It's been 17 years since the attacks, and that obviously hasn't happened. In fact, a lot of people believe that they're quote-unquote woke and awake to what's going on now, who just question everything and believe everything is a false flag. And I would largely blame figures like Alex Jones for pushing people into this mindset, where you start seeing the same people who question 9/11 start believing in chemtrails, start questioning every school shooting, thinking that the government has some kind of Machiavellian plot to stage school shootings as a means to take away our guns, even though we've had hundreds of school and mass shootings, and no government agency has effectively pushed some kind of gun grab after that. So I don't understand how this narrative keeps popping up over and over again when it comes to school shootings, that the government's going to take our guns. No, there's like barely any movement, legislation to take away our guns. I mean, after the Parkland shooting, some of those students who became like celebrity activists, got some traction, but what legislation came out of that? Nothing. So, yeah. I mean, the 9/11 Truth Movement was problematic from the very beginning for several reasons. And I'll go over some of the reasons why it was problematic. First of all, the rush to point fingers at who did it. It's understandable. I can understand why people would want to figure out who did it. I mean, that's what the U.S. government did with, and the neocons did with the, whoever did the attacks. They wanted to rush to judgment to retaliate and, to blanket retaliate against several people at once for the attacks, rushing to judgment. I believe that the 9/11 Truth Movement did a similar thing, rushed to judgment about who did it. Another thing I feel like the 9/11 Truth Movement did at the very beginning was make it all about the buildings. And while I do understand that, that's where most people died that day, as John Golds pointed out, it's obviously a very important factor of 9/11. To make everything about the buildings, I think, really does narrow your focus to something that is very complex and might possibly never really be figured out. And what I mean by that is a lot of the actual crime scene evidence for 9/11 has been demolished and destroyed and sold for scrap. So without that, a lot of this stuff falls into the realm of speculation. Now, I do believe there's a lot of important science being done. I think architects and engineers has been doing some really good work. The Alaska University of Fairbanks study into World Trade Center 7, I think, is probably one of the most valuable things they put together so far. That was funded by architects and engineers. Some of the other stuff, like examining the dust for thermetic materials, for incendiary materials, I'm not I just don't have the faith or the confidence that that's going to get much traction more than it already has. And sure, I think some of that research is valid, but you run into the problem of chain of custody when it comes to where did that dust come from? How do we know it wasn't contaminated, etc.? That's an issue, I think. So, that being said, that the evidence is gone, I think pouring so much energy into the buildings, I think could be a dead end. Now, I don't want to discount or minimize the importance of that because, like, if I'm being honest, I think it's pretty goddamn obvious that World Trade Center Building 7 was demolished. Controlled demolition was done on it somehow, some way. The World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2, it's very hard for me to see them anymore as a collapse. In fact, and this is just something personal I'll share, on the day of 9/11 itself, when we saw the first tower collapse, my friend and I, happened to be my roommate at the time, one of our first reactions was, what the fuck? Why does this look like a movie special effect? Like, it looks like the cover of Die Hard. I mean, what the hell is going on? We are for some reason, just on the day, I'm not saying that a genius or anything. I mean, actually, a lot of people watching this will probably think I'm insane, which is kind of unfortunate because I'll explain in a second. A lot of people who weren't conspiracy people had the same reaction that I did on the day of 9/11, the instant the tower collapsed. I talked to like Democrats in these Democratic meetup groups who were older, like in their 60s, who were like, "Oh yeah, when I saw the tower collapse, the first thing I thought was, how did it blow up? Who planted bombs in the building?" In fact, actually, there were FBI agents who thought the same thing on the day of 9/11. Firefighters as well. You can watch the Naday Brothers documentary on the firefighters. There's interviews with firefighters who are saying that it looked exactly like controlled demolition. It was like boom, 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 boom. It was like they had detonators timed to go off right after one another. These are things that firefighters said. These are all, these are all things, eyewitness testimony. You can't negate eyewitness testimony and just say, oh, they were confused. They thought it looked like explosions. They thought it sounded like explosions. You can't write off all the eyewitness testimony as that. And that's what a lot of 9/11 debunkers type people have done. But I guess just from my own personal point of view, ever since I watched the towers falling on the day of 9/11, I was never able to get it out of my head that something very odd happened to those towers to make them fall that way. So, and I'm comfortable with that. I'm not going to, but at the same time, I'm not going to like die on a hill for that. I'm not going to, go out there and do like a 10 tweet thread about how I think the World Trade Center was blown up. It's just something comfortable that I believe in, and I'm not going to, it's not my focus. There's other aspects of 9/11 too that I believe and that I think have validity that aren't my focus either. And I think what tends to happen is there's a lot of truthers out there who get very dogmatic and I know I got off on a tangent, but the dogma, I think, is part of what hurt the 9/11 truth movement out of the gates. It's this idea that, oh, well, you don't believe the planes were remote controlled? Oh, then you're a Lee hopper or something. Or, well, how could they have flown the planes? I mean, there's things about 9/11 that you don't have to agree with every conspiracy narrative to know and to understand in your heart that we were lied to by the Bush administration by what happened. It was a very odd event with a lot of unanswered questions. The buildings appeared to have been blown up. Even though we probably will never actually prove it or make a convincing case to the rest of society that happened. All these things being said, there was even a faction early on between people who didn't believe the buildings were blown up and the people who did. And it's like you can still, join into the same realm of research, even if you don't agree on that point. So I think this dogma is what really crippled the 9/11 truth movement to begin with. It was almost like you had to be on the same page or be in lockstep, or else you were some kind of sellout or shill, or, a lighter version of that would be you're a Lee hopper. Oh, you just believe they let it happen on purpose instead of made it happen on purpose. All these pointless arguments. There were truthers early on, like Mike Rupert, who refused to touch the buildings and instead wrote, very deep books on the subject about how the U.S. government and aspects of the Bush administration were very likely complicit without touching the buildings at all. He wrote a book called Crossing the Rubicon, which I highly recommend. It's still one of the better early 9/11 truth books out there. There are a lot of bad books, 9/11 truth books out there, but I would say that that's one of the good ones. Pam Ryan asked, where were the air defenses? Good question. We already know that NORAD lied and tried to cover up their own timeline of events. I'm not sure, maybe John Gold could correct me on this, but the FAA, I believe, also lied. So there were two agencies who would have been directly responsible for the air defenses. And not just that, but the White House. I think Donald Rumsfeld actually had authorization at that time to decide to shoot a plane down or not. So yeah, the air defenses were completely non-existent. Bird World says the drills on 9/11. Yes, there were many, many drills leading up to 9/11, and actually a drill happening on the day of 9/11, simulating a terrorist attack. So, yeah, all those things need to be looked at. All those things are compelling to me. Phantom says, could NORAD be lying to cover up their own shortcomings? Absolutely, they're lying. But the question is, were they told to lie by someone above them, or did they just decide to lie on their own? I think that it's less likely that NORAD actually just lied on their own, because all these agencies, to some extent, needed to coordinate their cover stories. So if they were just allowed to concoct their own cover story on their own, I don't think that it would have worked out. They sort of needed to be on the same page with other agencies. So, just back to the 9/11 Truth Movement really quick. I mean, I remember one of the first 9/11 Truth documentaries I saw had a lot of bad stuff in it that was all just, it was sloppy. It was called 9/11 in Plain Sight. It pushed the pod missile theory. It pushed the nothing crashed in Shanksville theory. And while I will acknowledge that's a very odd crash scene, wreckage, I tend to kind of stay away from the Shanksville stuff because I frankly don't, I'm not going to go out on a limb and suggest what happened there. I don't believe it was necessarily shot down either. I also don't believe the official story about United 93 passengers heroically taking over the plane and storming the cockpit. I don't believe those. But yeah, the truth movement got off on the wrong foot very early on. There were people who were being too careful, who were already sort of shaming people who were asking too many questions, and there are people who were asking too many questions that were kind of a distraction and that weren't really focusing on what was important. It took us years, it seems like, to even get to the point of learning who was in charge at the Alex station and who was responsible for dropping the ball and hiding that information. So that's like a key example of how someone could have stopped the 9/11 attacks but chose not to. Actually, multiple people. And we know their names now. None of this stuff was known back when 9/11 happened, but yet people would take these speculative leaps and say that George W. Bush was involved, Paul Wolfowitz was involved, Richard Armitage was involved, George Tenet was involved, Donald Rumsfeld was involved, Dick Cheney was involved. And while I'm actually not saying that none of those people are involved, those very much speculative leaps people were taking at the time. So that was a problem too. Another problem was the crazier theory started to sort of pop up following controlled demolition theories. If you didn't think controlled demolition was crazy enough, which a lot of people think it's insane to suggest that, which I frankly think is, I think is some form of mechanism of denial. I mean, there's actually a really interesting exchange that Joe Rogan has with a 9/11 debunker about Building 7. And Joe Rogan just concedes that, okay, we don't know if it was blown up or not. We don't know any of that stuff. But can't you at least agree that it looks exactly like controlled demolition and looks very odd? And this 9/11 debunker guy was actually having a really hard time because he knew that he would have to say yeah. So he refused to answer the question at first, and Joe Rogan's like, no, just just answer the question. Like, don't you think that it looks like controlled demolition and that it looks very strange? And the guy was like, yeah, I do think it looks like controlled demolition. So yeah, that's I guess that's what bothers me about people thinking it's so crazy and nutty and tinfoil hatty to say, yeah, Building 7 looks like it was blown up. Why does it look like that? And this thermal expansion explanation that the NIST gave for why WTC-7 looks like it just blew up and collapsed into its own footprint, frankly, just doesn't make sense. They proposed this theory that took them years and years after their original report for the two towers to explain this concept of thermal expansion. As it's a concept that never existed before with building disasters. They came up with a new concept for why Building 7 collapsed. That doesn't make sense. Pam Ryan asks if 93 wasn't brought down by passengers, what alternative theories are there? Good question, Pam. I don't know. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that the passengers really did take it down, other than secondhand information from relatives on the ground that allegedly spoke to people on the plane. Government agencies like the NTSB have shown the flight path from United 93 as evidence that the hijackers were trying to thwart actions of the passengers, because apparently the flight data recorder shows the plane going like this, like before it crashed, as a way for like the hijackers or whatever to like make people fly around the plane so they wouldn't be able to get to the cockpit. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. That's what the NTSB says. But what's interesting is the entire United 93 official story was fed by different government agencies to Paul Greengrass, the director of United 93, before a lot of the public actually had the evidence to view themselves. So what I just said about the NTSB flight path was referenced in the story of the movie United 93. It shows it happening. It shows like the hijackers flying like this, trying to thwart the passengers, but that wasn't even available to the public at the time. So it's actually kind of fascinating that two movies that have come out in the last decade or so that have had leaked classified information or just, not public information to the script writers was United 93 and Zero Dark 30. Those two films, the filmmakers behind them actually had information fed to them by government agencies. So I just think it's fascinating that film United 93 even got made in the first place, and is essentially dovetailing onto the sentencing hearing for Moussaoui, which inexplicably trots out all this new evidence for the United 93 crash scene and the debris in Shanksville, all to coincide with the release of this film United 93. That's also very bizarre. It almost seemed like the Bush administration wanted this film to essentially act in some capacity as an official narrative for what happened. So I got kind of in the weeds about the, what's crazy and what's not, but I think where the 9/11 truth movement really went off track. And yeah, Alex Jones was already causing enough damage to the truth movement already at this point. He totally was. I'm not going to deny that. I'm not going to spend too much time even talking about Jones, because I think there are worse people who actually opened the lid up for 9/11 truth movement to be even more crazier and more easily discredited. And people like Kevin Barrett try to rewrite their history now and say that they always were debunking the space beams and they disassociated themselves from Jim Fetzer once they realized he was a total nut, discrediting the movement. That's actually not true. Anyone could go back. People who've been in the movement long enough remember that Kevin Barrett and Jim Fetzer were kind of like a duo at a certain point. And what happened was they came out very strongly, the both of them, against Stephen Jones' thermite research. And the direction that they started to go into was that perhaps directed energy weapons, aka space beams, actually are what destroyed the World Trade Center. This is very interesting because it coincided with another strange event in the 9/11 Truth Movement, where people like Morgan Reynolds, who was a former Bush official, keep in mind. If anybody out there has heard the term sheep dipped, or hasn't heard the term, I'd recommend looking it up. This strange Bush insider named Morgan Reynolds started to get all these Fox News spots. Keep in mind, Kevin Barrett was also in the news too. I'm always suspicious when people get news spots really quickly for stuff like this. So, that's already suspicious enough to me. Jim Fetzer also got news spots around the same time. Morgan Reynolds actually got a Fox News spot to go on and talk about how the planes that hit the World Trade Centers were like Looney Tune cartoons, that they were holograms. And this figure named Judy Woods, popped up out of nowhere, who was this PhD professor who was putting out this theory as well. So you had Morgan Reynolds, Kevin Barrett, Jim Fetzer, and who else? Who else did I forget? And Judy Wood, sort of all coming out of the woodwork at the same time and pushing these very discreditable theories that made all other truthers look fucking nuts. So I think that's really when the 9/11 Truth Movement took a big turn into the disinfo operation world. That there were people or forces trying to feed disinformation into the movement to try to ruin it completely, because apparently Alex Jones wasn't enough to ruin it. And for that moment forward, what happened was those types of videos, directed energy weapon videos, websites, hologram planes videos, started to flood the internet in a very bizarrely, artificially boosted way that I've always thought it was artificial. I haven't met any other truther in real life who believes that. So it's very weird, actually, because architects and engineers, when Richard Gage was in charge of it, people started to make confrontation videos where they were like, "Hi, Richard, what do you think about Judy Wood's directed energy beam theory? And why did you try to cover it up?" And blah, blah, blah. There's like dozens of videos of apparently Judy Wood followers, which in and of itself seems fake to me. I'm sorry, it seems fucking fake. Would actually go to 9/11 Truth Movement events and disrupt them and confront people who were not pushing the space beam theory. So that's when stuff started to get really wacky, really fucking wacky. And of course, Kevin Barrett and Jim Fetzer are two of the primary people who are still pushing these theories that a lot of different things are false flags, like mass shootings. Jim Fetzer actually went to the city that Sandy Hook Elementary School is in. He went to their city council meeting and talked about how there's kids that are still alive that didn't really die. Kevin Barrett wrote a book about how the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting was a false flag 3 months after it happened. 3 months. And I'm not overtly saying these people are disinfo agents. I'm just merely saying this is charlatanism, pure and simple. There are people in the 9/11 Truth Movement who are interested in serious research and inquiry, who aren't interested in selling books or selling products. And then there are people who are charlatans and who release books months after an attack happens saying that it's a false flag. I'll just say that's extremely irresponsible and suspicious at the very least. Let's just say you thought the Orlando nightclub shooting was a false flag and that was your gut reaction to it. Let's just say that. If you're serious about it and you're serious about making that credible, I think you kind of need to spend maybe a year on researching that before releasing something about it. I mean, that's just my opinion. You know, maybe there's some geniuses out there who can do a intensive research project in 3 months and pop out a whole book about it. I wouldn't characterize Kevin Barrett as a genius, so put him in the charlatan category. What's unfortunate is I actually did tabling at a 9/11 Truth Film Festival in Oakland, and he's the odd man out selling books about how mass shootings are false flags, tabling at these events. Everyone else is specifically focusing on 9/11, but yet because he has some kind of authority in the movement, they let him come and table his shit about how Charlie Hebdo is a false flag, how Pulse nightclub shooting is a false flag. And, you know, that's kind of well-poisoning behavior, in my opinion. And I don't go to that event anymore. And I actually haven't been invited back since I tweeted that Kevin Barrett is a charlatan for selling these kinds of books and making money off of these events without spending more than 2 or 3 months researching them. So that's fine. There are some other people that still go to the event that I respect and that still decide to talk there. Mickey Huff and Peter Phillips of Project Censored are doing some stuff there this year. And I think it's actually in a couple days. It's at the Grand Lake Theater. But if you go there this year, you'll see the same thing I'm describing. You'll see all these other people selling books and movies and stickers and paraphernalia having to do with 9/11 specifically. And you go to Kevin Barrett's table and you'll find some strange books about other false flag attacks that it's very troublesome, to say the least. So that to me is where a lot of things sort of went downhill. And what's interesting is, you know, he still has some kind of presence in the truth movement, and a lot of his followers will come at me, you know, and say that I am a shill or a sellout for not talking about the Israeli role in 9/11 or not talking about the buildings enough or whatever, but seemingly worship people like that. So I find that very bizarre, that because I'm more careful and delicate about the way I approach it, I'm considered a shill, but people who are injecting blatant disinfo into the movement are not considered shills. I mean, that's where my mind would go in terms of who's a shill or not. And then there's became this mindset that I think is very problematic, where you're a part of a limited hangout if you don't expand the paradigm enough of what you're talking about in regards to 9/11. So, for example, 9/11 Press for Truth, which I think is one of the most credible documentaries ever made about 9/11, it got bashed by a lot of people in the truth movement because they said it's a limited hangout. It's saying that the Saudis were involved. It's saying that Pakistan was involved. It's not talking about the buildings, so it's a limited hangout. It's talking about things like intelligence failures. Even though I think if you talk to Ray and John about what they think is a failure and what's not, they wouldn't describe it so much as a failure as if it's much as a deliberate cover-up or deliberate, you know, malfeasance or, you know, hiding information. So there was a Bird World. This just says, I've defended you against Adam Green. He hasn't seen a very heavy agenda, obviously. I think he might have, actually. I mean, you know, I'm not going to talk any shit about Adam personally. The problem I see with sort of what his approach is he thinks if I don't talk about Israelis and 9/11 as much, it means I'm afraid of being called an anti-Semite. You know, it's a weird thing that some of these Israel to 9/11 truthers do, is their entire paradigm revolves around that idea that, you know, Israel did it. And, you know, if you talk about the Saudi aspect, you're doing a limited hangout because you're not talking about Israel. Or if you talk about only U.S. involvement or only the neocons, you're a limited hangout because you're not talking about Israel. I mean, this is what I mean by dogmatic point of view in the 9/11 truth movement is I take in everything. I mean, like, even from people who, this is probably going to get me in trouble, but I'll check out something by someone like Christopher Borlin, who I think is a blatant anti-Semite and a nationalist. People have sent me links by him. I'll read them and I'll be like, well, this doesn't really hold water for me. And I get the vibe that this guy's kind of an anti-Semite. But even just saying that, it's like there's so many people who worship these figures in 9/11 Truth Movement, or even just saying that, it's like, oh, you're a sellout. You're part of a limited hangout if you don't go there. Like it's like a third rail within the third rail of 9/11. I take in a lot of different information on 9/11. If I find something valuable, that it's a verifiable fact and a shitty book by a shitty author, it's still valuable information. I mean, there's a lot of crappy 9/11 books out there that have kernels of information in them or truth that you can verify and be like, oh, I never caught that in another book before. So that's why I think it's valuable to take in a lot of different sides. And I'm just going to go through a few of my favorite books right now on 9/11 that, I think, and this is going to sort of cross over a large spectrum here. And I'll also tell you some of my problems with these books too. So I'm not just endorsing these wholeheartedly. And I'm going to move on to some other subjects here. So just once I finish with this, showing you some of my influences and some of my favorite books, I'll move on to some other topics. This is a book that John Gold told me about a while ago, Disconnecting the Dots by Kevin Fenton. It's probably one of the more difficult books to read on 9/11, but it's also one of the most important. So if you want something a little easier to digest, to sink your teeth into, I wouldn't read this one first because you need to have a little bit more of a foundational knowledge about like the hijackers who were involved in 9/11, where they lived, their backstories. Even though this book does give some of that information, I feel like you would benefit from learning more first. And John actually just recommended one of my favorite 9/11 books in the chat, The Complete 9/11 Timeline by Paul Thompson. I believe another name for it was the Terror Timeline. I might be mistaken about that. But it's a very dense book. It's thick. And it goes into exquisite detail about the attacks and leading up to them. And Paul Thompson, is one of the most dedicated and also careful 9/11 researchers out there. Another book that I found really valuable is one that goes more into what I describe. Oh, I should tell you, Kevin Fenton's book is very specifically about the Alex Station, about the CIA and their relationship with the FBI and how they hid information from the FBI, who hid it, who was involved, what people in the FBI were investigating the 9/11 attacks, what people in the FBI were responsible for tracking some of these people down, how they weren't basically allowed to because the information was blocked from them. And I believe Kevin Fenton was the first person to actually out Rich Blee, the previously unknown name of the man in charge of Bin Laden's, the Bin Laden unit, the Alex Station, by the CIA. Another 9/11 researcher that I found his work to be pretty valuable. It's a little more in the speculative realm. I would say this takes more leaps than almost any other book that I've read on the subject that I think is really valuable. But it comes at the attacks with the premise of, so we know the 19 hijackers were supposedly, allegedly, involved. They're the ones who flew planes. But what about if we look at all these other officials, government officials, private industry people, and really make a list of how many of them had connections to the 9/11 attacks in strange and suspicious ways, and the subsequent cover-up. What Kevin Ryan does in Another 19 is he actually compiles a list of who he thinks are 19 potential suspects that are domestic. And this is actually where I learned all the bizarre stuff about Rudy Giuliani and his strange connections to 9/11. And then after I read this book, found out a lot more stuff about his involvement in the anthrax cover-up and also profiting off those attacks. So Another 19 is very interesting. It mentions a lot of obscure people that you don't hear about in a lot of other 9/11 books or movies. Alien Scientist, someone brought up earlier, did a really interesting video compilation going through, summing up a lot of the points in Kevin Ryan's book. I think it's a very good video. I'd recommend checking that out. And there's some other, just interesting connections in that book. I mean, Paul Bremer, his relationship to Kissinger and Associates and Marshall McClellan, very interesting. So many interesting details come out in that book. And, even though Kevin Ryan does take some speculative leaps, I mean, a lot of them, he's jam-packed it with so much detail that, you can use it as a springboard to do some of your own research, sort of like how I've done with Rudy Giuliani. So there's two other books that I wanted to bring up that I have problems with, but they're still interesting books in the sense that they provide a narrative to 9/11 that isn't commonly found in the 9/11 truth movement. And there are interesting things in them, even though both authors I have problems with. And I think that, let's just put it that way. You'll see why I say that. One of those books that I think has interesting things in it, but is problematic for many different ways, or for many different reasons, is what Webster Tarpley's book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror. Webster Tarpley, I think, is a fucking dickhead. But one of the interesting aspects of his book that sets it apart from other 9/11 books is he believes there was like a coup performed against people in the Bush administration. Specifically, he doesn't appear to blame Bush or Cheney or several top Bush officials at all for the attacks. Instead, his theory is that there was a shadow government that was holding the Bush administration hostage, and that sort of forced their hand and made them do all this post 9/11 stuff. That's an odd theory, but it's an interesting one that sets it apart from other 9/11 books. So I'm not saying definitely read this book. And Charlie Brown says shadow government equals Mossad. Well, Webster Tarpley never says that in his book. And I think part of the problem with some of the stuff, Boylan and some of this other stuff is that even if in theory someone from the Mossad or the Israeli government had some involvement in the attacks, there's so many other aspects of 9/11. I mean, we know there was Saudi involvement. We know there was U.S. involvement. And yeah, I'm just going to say for the record, Charlie, I feel like saying something like, well, he is wrong or afraid, that's actually kind of what I was referring to earlier about this dogmatic point of view. I don't think you can say that. Let's just say this. I have zero respect for Webster Tarpley. But I don't think that he was afraid to say it. Why would he be afraid? He's already writing a book called 9/11 Synthetic Terror about how the attacks were staged. And no, I disagree that Antidote on YouTube is doing the best stuff on 9/11. In fact, they promote Kevin Barrett's stuff pretty regularly. So no, I disagree with that. But I appreciate, I respect your point of view. I'm not going to block you from the chat for promoting stuff that you think is valuable. I just happen to not agree with it. But one of the other books that I thought was very valuable in my 9/11 research, and is one of the first 9/11 books that I read, is Crossing the Rubicon by Mike Ruppert, R.I.P. Crossing the Rubicon is about, Norman Coroner asked, wasn't Webster Tarpley in the LaRouche movement in the past? Yes, he was, Norman. He definitely was. But this book by Mike Ruppert, I think it gets ignored by certain truthers because it doesn't talk about the buildings at all. It's more making the case, I guess, that, it's somehow become a pejorative now, of LEHOP, let it happen on purpose. Stand downs, all the warnings leading up to 9/11, the drills. Mike Ruppert was one of the first person who uncovered the drills and found that they might have interfered with the ability to prevent the attacks. Mike Ruppert was also one of the first person to speculate that Paul Wellstone, someone who was putting heat on the Bush administration for 9/11, was murdered in a plane crash. That's actually interesting because Jesse Ventura, who's like a pretty full-blown truther now, says that he doesn't think Paul Wellstone was murdered at all, and I guess he was good friends with them. So even though this was a facet of 9/11 that would come up pretty often, that I believe came from Mike Ruppert, it's not really a popular one that you hear about much anymore. And I'm not sure why that is. But I see it come up occasionally about Paul Wellstone. Pierce Redmond asks if I still watch Alien Scientist. I actually haven't seen his videos in a while. I know he goes into a little bit of he does stuff on like UFOs and stuff that I don't watch. So no, I actually haven't watched his stuff in a long time. I think that his video, I think it's called 9/11 Solved or something like that, is pretty good, and it's largely based on Kevin Ryan's research. This is an interesting book, a very small book, and it's also written by a problematic author. I wouldn't say he's as problematic as Chris Boylan. I don't think he's as blatantly anti-Semitic or as blatantly nationalist. However, it's actually written by one of the founders of antiwar.org, and I don't know why. I'm actually surprised he's managed to escape smears over writing this book, which you can still buy on Amazon. It's called The Terror Enigma, 9/11 and the Israeli Connection by Justin Raimondo. Justin Raimondo is struggling with cancer right now. I believe he's getting chemotherapy. I wish him well. I hope that he recovers. That being said, he seems to have a virulent hatred for anyone who accuses Trump of being a warmonger or a neocon now. And he promotes Ann Coulter as being an anti-war hero. He calls me a commie on Twitter, even though I'm like borderline socialist. It's just weird stuff. And I'm not, he's probably pilled up. He's probably, the cancer treatments, it's probably very painful. I don't know if the opiates are making him say that or what, but the book is interesting in the sense that it actually, it has a lot of real information in it, but it also smears, which I think is kind of funny. It smears 9/11 truthers in it by saying that basically implying that anyone who would question the U.S. government of having a role in the attacks is a fucking idiot. And he spends about 2 pages bashing Cynthia McKinney for suggesting that the Bush administration had some involvement in the attacks. It's pretty odd because, I mean, his entire book is just boiling it all down to this idea that Israel did it. But yet he's criticizing people who suggest the U.S. had a role. Well, again, even if Israel was partly behind it, the U.S. would have still had to cover it up and enable it. So even if you believe that, it's just still odd. And I think there is a blind spot with some of these Israel did 9/11 Israel did 9/11 people, where there is sort of a weird nationalism that prevents them from believing that there were multiple agencies, groups involved, and that it definitely required on some level an American involvement. I've seen some of them too try to move the goalpost by saying, well, all the neocons are really Zionists, double agents anyways, who worked in the Bush administration. This is an oversimplification. I think 9/11, frankly, was a very uniquely American thing. I believe Project for the New American Century and the goals stated in it is a uniquely American thing. I think it mutually benefits Israel. The war on terror does. But I don't believe neocons are driven by their desire to protect Israel. I simply do not believe that. And I could argue, and people want to argue with me, that's fine. But for some reason, this is something that keeps coming up over and over again. There's even a video made about me on how I'm an apologist for Zionism because I think neoconservatism is a uniquely American thing. So this is all this weirdness, and this is part of what I mean by dogma. I mean, I'm willing to take pieces from Justin Raimondo's book, look at them, examine them under a microscope, and vet them if they're true or not. One of the things he talks about in his book that is very true, that you can go watch right now, is the what's it called? The Amdocs Fox News 4-part report. You should go back and watch that. It's very fascinating. And that's something that Justin Raimondo talked about in his book that I didn't ever hear about until that. So that's just what I mean by taking parts from books, even the books that are problematic. You might find things that are valuable for other reasons. Sorry, a bunch of questions have piled up now. I'm going to step out of the room just for a second, go to little boy's room, and I'll be right back, okay? So hold tight. Okay, enough about Raimondo's book. I feel bad even being critical because of what he's going through right now. This is probably the most mainstream book that I think still has really valuable information in it. It's The Commission by Phil Shenan, New York Times reporter. It basically obliterates the 9/11 Commission and proves that it was completely set up to fail. They had the conclusions of the report pre-written before the commission even started. So many examples of obstruction, so many examples of people in the Bush administration trying to basically fix the commission, how Philip Zelikow was essentially taking orders and sharing notes with Karl Rove during the commission. How Philip Zelikow, the guy who's essentially in charge of the commission, was a neocon, 100% a fucking neocon. And how there's actually Iraq war propaganda in the 9/11 Commission report itself. They actually bring in an old school neocon from like pre-PNAC named Laurie Milroy to talk about how Iraq blew up the World Trade Center in '93. So I recommend this book. I mean, the author of this book doesn't think that the U.S. government was anything but negligent in the attacks, but that doesn't mean that there's not valuable information in here. So just giving you some examples of the different information that I take in. This book I actually haven't finished reading yet, but so far I think it's great. Is Peter Dale Scott, who is the guy who actually coined the term deep state. He wrote a book called The Road to 9/11. I haven't finished it yet, but I would definitely check it out. And there's two other books which I think are really worth checking out as well. They aren't related directly to 9/11, but I think that to really understand 9/11 better and to just have a wider body of knowledge about it. Oh yeah, Birdworldist, Daniel Hopsicker's book too. I actually gave that to Abby as a gift a few months ago, so I don't have it in front of me right now. If you want to remind me of the title, I'll give it a plug on here. Because it's a great book. I read it. And there's also a documentary based off of his book you can stream it on YouTube. I think it's up there right now. So two books about the anthrax attacks, which I think are required reading for anybody who's got any interest in the subject. The 2001 Anthrax Deception by Graham McQueen. This one blew my mind when I first read it. He takes some speculative leaps, but he also compiles a very interesting timeline and combs through a lot of the details about the attacks. And he alleges a domestic conspiracy and alleges that it wasn't Bruce Ivins who did the attacks, and that it actually might have been a government conspiracy. Now, in case anybody out there doesn't know, I've made a documentary called American Anthrax. I also talk about anthrax quite a bit in A Very Heavy Agenda as well. And I've gotten shit for not pushing the Philip Zach did the anthrax attacks narrative. I mean, the issue for me is that I just didn't personally know much about that when I made that original film. And I still think it's a very compelling story. I mean, I'm going to include it on my October 5th Anthrax broadcast of Media Roots Radio. But, people just sometimes are very quick. Like, I remember when I first released American Anthrax, I got a piece of mail, like physically in the mail, from someone who was just like, they like in the letter, they were kind of just jumping down my throat for not making it all about Philip Zach, and why didn't I talk about this? Why didn't I talk about that? I mean, I guess I just don't understand that attitude in the truth movement. You should always assume that people are, open to hearing new information, but there is, I think, this paranoia or suspicious mindset that kind of goes along with it, where if someone doesn't talk about things enough or doesn't talk about this enough, then maybe they're a limited hangout, or maybe they're a shill or something. And I feel like that mindset has been very destructive for the truth movement. I mean, very, very destructive. And it's also helped turn off a lot of mainstream reporters to the movement. And I'm not making excuses for them. You know, the fact that they've killed their own curiosity over this is very pathetic and shameful. But it wasn't helped by the fact that a lot of dogmatic truthers were getting in people's faces and saying, why don't you talk about Building 7? Why don't you talk about this? Why don't you I mean, that kind of mindset, I think, is very destructive. Here's another anthrax book that I think is really worth checking out. It's not written by a conspiracy guy. It doesn't really speculate on the nature of the attacks themselves. What it does speculate on is the propaganda that the Bush administration put out and the sort of climate of fear surrounding the attacks. It's written by Philip Saracen. I don't know if it's translated. Yeah, translated from German. But the book is excellent. I think besides Graham McQueen's book, it's definitely the best anthrax book that I've read that challenges what we've sort of officially been told. Yeah, so there's already, I mean, this is the problem with doing anything 9/11 is you already get these sort of like dogmatic fucking weirdos in the chat. So it's this some guy named AEM says, is your job to run a protection racket for Israelis' involvement in 9/11? Oh, okay. I think I think I already know who this guy is. Yeah, I mean, it's just such an odd thing to tell somebody, especially somebody who's released a podcast all about how the Palestinians were being framed for the attacks. But it's so, you know, like I said, I try to take in a lot of different narratives about 9/11 from all different kinds of truthers. And just looking at the chat. What's your relationship with Hillary's advisor, Sidney Blumenthal? That's pretty good. None. My relationship is none. L and F says, hey, Robbie, have you looked into the Sybil Edmonds case regarding 9/11? And if so, any thoughts? I have. And I'm kind of... Pierce's comment. I'll just say no comment on that for now. What are your thoughts on Pearl Harbor? I have a lot of thoughts about it. I mean, I could go into the weeds about it, but I feel like we should stick to 9/11 on this one. One of the more compelling stories about the Pearl Harbor attacks for me, which kind of gets ignored in a similar way to the USS Liberty attacks, is the idea that Japanese were using kamikaze mini submarines meant to just sink to the bottom of the ocean. They weren't even meant to like come back home. They were specially built kamikaze submarines, were spotted by U.S. patrol ships, naval patrol ships, I think something like 3 miles out of Pearl Harbor. It was radioed in 45 minutes or so before the attack actually started. The official story is that the commanders at the base, back at the base, didn't believe this naval patrol ship. They thought they were just seeing things. That story's never made sense to me. So there's information out there that there did seem to be some kind of a stand down by certain aspects of the military during Pearl Harbor. I can't go into the details about it now. I don't know enough about it. I haven't studied it in a while. But I wanted to make sure I answered some more questions that I promised I was going to answer earlier from people who were asking them, and I got totally sidetracked. But Pierce, I remember you had a question earlier, and I forgot to answer it. If you're still there, Pierce, remind me what that question was again, if you can. I'm going to go up to make sure I didn't miss it. Hold on a second. Oh, so I guess the 9/11 Truth Film Festival is today in Oakland. It's actually happening right now. I wasn't aware of that. Well, I can't scroll far back up enough to see it. So, Pierce. Oh, yeah. The phone calls. L and F. I think this is the problem. I agree with you, L and F. I believe Israel is a client state of the U.S., not the other way around. And I think that it does sort of fall into this weird sort of right-wing nationalistic mindset to believe that Israel somehow dictates what the United States does. I believe that sort of comes from the paleo-conservative sort of patriot movement, nationalist scene, where America is the most powerful empire in the world. The most powerful corporations in the world are headquartered in the United States. We're born here. We have the most powerful military in the world. We have the largest military presence in the world. That sort of implies that Israel holds us hostage. I think that's a garbage theory. I don't personally subscribe to it. So I think this is where sort of why I come into contact with sort of these people who, demand I say that all neocons are primarily doing the bidding of Israel and all this stuff. I mean, it just doesn't line up with my worldview. Even though I do think, and I'll say it again, that of course the things that neocons are doing are extremely mutually beneficial to Israel. There's no doubt about that. And some of them are obviously very Zionist as well. Yeah. So Pierce is asking about the phone calls. This is a realm of 9/11 speculation that's gotten a lot of people into trouble, because if you question anything about the phone calls at all, that leads to the inevitable of, oh, you think these loved ones made it up, that they're lying about talking to their relatives. Or you think that they were voice morphed and that it wasn't actually their real voices, and that that somehow a computer speech synthesizer convinced these relatives that they were actually talking to their family members or loved ones. And then you get to another more absurd theory, which was sort of laid out in that fictional documentary Operation Terror, where they made them all the people from the plane get off and executed them in an autoclave like a giant oven. So I try not to go there. But I do think that aspects of the phone calls are very strange. Someone brought up, I forgot who it was in the super chat earlier, about box cutters. So we're supposed to believe that the hijackers took over the cockpits with box cutters. Um, it's that in and of itself is strange because as the person brought up, there would have been, if you slit someone's throat with a box cutter, there would have been blood all over the plane. Especially if you slit a pilot's throat in the cockpit, it would have been blood all over the cockpit. How do you then fly a plane and use the controls when there's everything's covered in blood? That is an odd part of the narrative that hasn't really ever added up to me. Pierce says some of the calls refer to the hijackers having mace on board. Some of them are calm. Curious what you make of all that. I don't really honestly know what I make of it, Pierce, because one of the only phone calls that we actually have a recording of was done by a flight attendant named Betty Ong. And I'm trying to remember which flight I think she was on flight 77. And in that phone call, she seems incredibly calm. She doesn't describe that there are hijackers. She doesn't use the word Middle Eastern. All she describes is that there's smoke that's hurting people's eyes in business class of the plane, and they can't reach the cockpit. They've been trying to call the cockpit, and they can't reach it. And I think she also describes some people going into the cockpit as well. She doesn't describe, and she also says someone was stabbed. She doesn't say they were killed. She doesn't describe what the hijackers look like. You'd think if someone had just hijacked a plane, one of your first things to do would be to describe their appearance. It's a very strange phone call. And I don't know if it was, I don't remember if it was with Tom and you or we talked about this, but I mean, you could make like a David Lynch movie just out of her phone call because it's so strange and paint such a different picture of what actually happened on those planes. And then there's also another voicemail that was left. I believe her name was Cece Lyle, on her home phone answering machine. And her husband has been interviewed about this phone message. It's one of the only two recordings. Actually, I think it's one of the only two recordings that exist from the planes, allegedly, phone calls. And her husband actually was interviewed later, and he says that, I thought I was dreaming when I got the call. I must have been half awake when I got the call because one of the first things I thought was, that's impossible that she was able to call me from her cell phone on the plane. So that there's definitely some strange anomalies there. I mean, I don't know how much it's worth diving into that and examining every facet of that. But there's definitely some weird shenanigans going on with the FAA and the government agencies lying about, they all had airphones, then later saying, they had cell phones. And then when people were like, well, how do they call from cell phones? Because most cell phones didn't even work back then on planes. They're like, they just flew really low to avoid like radar detection or something. And that's how they're able to call. But technically the problem with that theory is if that's how they're able to make the cell phone calls, is a plane goes so fast that you're jumping to different cell phone towers much quicker than you would be like on the ground or in a plane. So it really doesn't matter how low to the ground you are. It's more the airspeed you're traveling at that would make it very difficult for you to conduct a phone call from a cell phone on a plane. That remains true to this day. I mean, try calling someone from a plane on a cell phone. It's very difficult to get through. So, I mean, I can't deny any of that stuff. But I put it into the realm more of just like curiosity and sort of a interesting aspect of 9/11 that's never really been explained. Yeah, Phantom, you said they're probably fabrications. I mean, here's the problem with that argument is I have an audio engineering background. I've worked extensively with DSP, speech synthesis. an actual more like spectral morphing audio technology, audio algorithms, and around 9/11, this technology was very much in its infancy. Um, the only argument you can make is that the government is sitting on super sophisticated speech synthesis technology that, you know, the regular world hasn't even caught up to 17 years later. Um, it's not easy for me to swallow that. So no, I don't. I mean, I think I very much lean towards the idea that these were real phone calls done by these real people. And you could actually hear it for yourself. I mean, you can go listen to her voicemail right now. Pam Ryan is referring to the CC Lyle voicemail, saying it's a frame up. She does whisper something at the end of the phone call, but we don't know what she actually says. So it's creepy. I mean, the phone call is creepy. Very creepy. I tried to do some audio forensic analysis on the phone call, and one of the things that I found, I was bored one day. I found the phone call message very creepy. And in my analysis, I found a male voice in the background actually saying the phrase World Trade Center. So that's odd. But that could just mean that people somehow got a hold of people on the plane to let them know that the attacks were taking place. It's still creepy. Still very, very creepy. AEM asks, if Israel is a client state, then why is Trump fulfilling all of Israel firsters' wishes? Well, one explanation for that is that Sheldon Adelson was one of his biggest donors. In terms of any agenda based on his donors that Trump was supposed to carry out, that's one of the clearest lines we can actually draw from one of his donors to his policies. I also think Israel firsters, especially the ones in the United States, well, no, let me take that back. I think, yes, there probably are plenty of Israel firsters, but I don't think they are the dominant class of who's driving our foreign policy. I think that because a lot of our foreign policy is mutually beneficial to Israel, and I guess, I mean, maybe that's hard for people to wrap their head around, or they think that it must be Israel dictating like how we conduct our foreign policy or what we do. But I think it has more to do with American hegemony and sort of our will. So so moving the embassy to Jerusalem, for example, setting that in stone, I don't think Israel forced Trump's hand or dictated to the Trump administration what to do. I think that as far as Trump administration saw it, and as far as Trump saw it, it was like, this is like sort of Americana. This is American hegemony to move that embassy there. It's like all the previous presidents sort of pussyfooted around it and used it as a leveraging tool. Even though they said they agreed with the idea of doing it, they didn't actually do it. Trump finally did it. So, you know, I mean, unless your argument is that Israel wasn't dictating before, but now with Trump they are. I just don't understand why that's sort of the go-to mindset. But yeah, there's too much. Just reading, see if there's any other actual questions in here that I missed. No, I didn't discuss Bin Laden's involvement, Phantom. Um, Bin Laden's involvement in 9/11 is a very, very strange aspect of it. Um, I'm just trying to think of how to start on this subject. Um, yeah, I'm not really sure what how to comment on Bin Laden, other than to say that that fat Bin Laden confession video that people describe. Um, I think that the video actually does really show Bin Laden, but he isn't actually confessing to the attacks in it. And there's an interesting Guardian article that came out many years ago that speculated, with good evidence, that that there were people that lured Bin Laden to record that video who were actually set up by the CIA. That video confession might have actually been a setup to try to get a confession out of Bin Laden on camera, unsuccessfully, might I add, because he doesn't actually confess to the attacks in it. He just talks about how happy he was, how it was a miracle that the floors collapsed and all this stuff. So I think that that's very possible. One other interesting aspect of Bin Laden is one of them people, Rich Blee, who was in charge of the Bin Laden unit, Alex Station for the CIA, was also in charge of the mission to capture or kill Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan after the assault on Afghanistan by the U.S. military. You can actually find media reports from around the time of that invasion where it's made very clear. The Bush administration didn't even deny this. They actually said it openly, as that they are not going after bin Laden for the first 2 months of the assault. Now, we hear all this narrative now about how, we let bin Laden slip through our fingers. He escaped through the mountains of Tora Bora. I mean, it seems pretty goddamn obvious that we let him escape on purpose. I mean, if you just look at all the facts, I'm not even talking about any of the speculation. So that's just a weird aspect in and of itself because, I mean, the Bush administration actually could have benefited greatly in a PR move just from killing bin Laden back then. So the fact that they didn't is very interesting. And it also raises questions about bin Laden's family and overlap with the Bush family and also being protected by Saudi Arabia. I mean, the bin Laden family business is still the largest construction company in Saudi Arabia. Bandar Bush has met bin Laden. Bandar Bush, the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, given a nickname by the Bush family. He claims that he met bin Laden before he became a black sheep of the family, even though there is a lot of contradictory evidence, and that actually seems like bullshit, that bin Laden was a black sheep of the family and was sort of exiled from the family the years leading up to 9/11 when he got involved with Al-Qaeda. That doesn't hold water either. There's also a verified story that's been verified since its release by La Figaro that claims a CIA station chief, doesn't name him, came to visit bin Laden in the hospital while he was getting dialysis treatments in Dubai. Very odd. So I'm not gonna. I don't think you can speculate that bin Laden is like on the CIA payroll, or he was still like around the time of 9/11. I see it more like we were using him as a PR prop, and he had enough ties to people who might have been involved in the attacks or different things like that even if he knew that he wasn't directly behind them, that the U.S. government would be gunning for him anyways and would take him out. Why was bin Laden murdered and dumped at sea and not brought to trial like Noriega and Saddam? Well, I think, I mean, to me, the reasons are probably because he would have had things to say that would have either blown wide open the 9/11 official story, or putting him on trial would have been very bad PR for the 9/11 official story. I don't know. And plus, that whole story about how he was buried at sea, and that whole thing is very bizarre. And I, frankly, don't even know if it's real. I mean, it's very, very strange story about how they got bin Laden. See if there's any other stories or questions I'm missing. Oh, I wanted to show another book written by the enemy. It's a different type of 9/11 book, but this to me just really does prove and solidify the fact that the neocons were trying very, very hard to tie Iraq to the 9/11 attacks, and not just by dropping little talking points here and there or speculation, but here's Stephen Hayes of the Weekly Standard, who wrote an entire book, actually, saying that Saddam Hussein and bin Laden collaborated together, and that's partly how the 9/11 attacks took place. Richard Pearl and David Frum, in a book that they wrote way after the Iraq War, or actually, no, it wasn't after the Iraq War, it was right at the beginning of it, were already, putting in print the same thing. But I promised one of the things I would do today would be to read some stuff about Giuliani and why I think he's one of the most interesting 9/11 suspects. And made even more interesting now that he's Trump's lawyer. And Trump just tweeted out today how good of a job Giuliani did on 9/11 and how he's a hero and how he should be celebrated. So let me just read you a section from Another 19. So this is from page 245 of Another 19. The history of Rudy. Rudy Giuliani was born as an only child in 1944. Rudy's father, Harold Giuliani, was a convicted hold-up man who served time in Sing Sing prison and was later employed as an enforcer for mafia loan shark operation. Rudy's uncle, Leo Diavanzo, ran a loan sharking and gambling operation with Jimmy Dono, who was a made man. Additionally, Rudy's cousin, Louis Diavanzo, was a stone-cold gangster who was shot to death in 1977 by FBI agents when he tried to run them down with his car. Of course, the sins of this father and his uncle and his cousin should not be used to judge Rudy himself. Although Rudy was close to his family, that doesn't mean he inherited the family penchant for mafia associations. These connections to the mob are worth considering. However, that Rudy hired mafia-connected companies to clean up Ground Zero after the attacks. Additionally, Rudy's friend and close colleague Bernard Kerik, whose police department provided crucial 9/11 evidence, was also linked to organized crime. And worth considering is that, as mentioned in the introduction, deep events often involve cooperation between government leaders and organized crime. Despite, or perhaps due to his family's background, Giuliani's career soared from the start as if he had friends in high places. At the age of 29, after graduating from law school and working briefly for a judge in NYC, Giuliani was appointed as the attorney in charge of the cases resulting from the Knapp Commission's investigation of police corruption. 2 years later, in 1975, Giuliani was named Associate Deputy Attorney General and Chief of Staff to Deputy Attorney General Harold Tyler. A former judge from the Southern District of New York, Tyler was the original choice to be the Watergate special prosecutor, but he rejected the position. He was then brought into the Ford administration, along with his young chief of staff, Giuliani. Specifically to restore the public trust after Watergate, Giuliani worked with Ford administration officials, including Ford's chief of staff, Dick Cheney, during this time. As early as May 1976, Rudy was warning about domestic terrorism and recommending that intelligence collection policies be relaxed. In 1981, at the age of 37, Reagan appointed Giuliani to be Associate Attorney General, the third highest position in the Department of Justice. In this position, he supervised several law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Corrections and the Drug Enforcement Administration. Journalist Gary Webb reported that the DIA protected Norman Menzies during his time while Menzies ran cocaine into the United States to fund the Nicaraguan Contras. Rudy's mentor, Harold Tyler, became the chief author of a report that exonerated the Reagan administration of any wrongdoing related to the 1980 killings of 4 American nuns in El Salvador. At the time, L. Paul Bremer was effectively running the State Department that had commissioned the report, and Brian Michael Jenkins was reportedly running a war on terror against the citizens of Nicaragua. And just for the record, Paul Bremer and Brian Michael Jenkins are two people that Kevin Ryan suspects as being involved in the attacks. While Giuliani was in the Justice Department, he chaired a committee that provided oversight to the government's use of the software called PROMIS, a database interrogation program. PROMIS was used by Oliver North to track terrorist threats and may have evolved into a tool for deep state uses. Reportedly, the software is also used by Continuity of Government Group led by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Richard Clarke. An enhanced version of PROMIS was said to be capable of functioning as a tool for espionage, collecting and relaying information from the systems on which it was installed without knowledge of the system owners. One of Giuliani's colleagues in the department, Peter Videnkis, was involved with illegally distributing the enhanced PROMIS software to foreign governments with the approval of high-level Justice Department officials. Giuliani was appointed U.S. Attorney for SDNY in 1983. It was in this high position that he first gained national prominence by prosecuting high-profile cases, including those of Wall Street figures Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken. As the U.S. Attorney for SDNY from 1983 to 1989, Giuliani was not only handling drug and organized crime cases, he was also in charge of representing the Federal Reserve Bank in its enforcement actions against the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the BCCI. These actions led to a RICO plea agreement and forfeiture of BCCI's United States assets, valued at $550 million. It was reported that during this time, Giuliani received documents about secret bank accounts related to terrorist financing that were held by companies like Citibank, Barclays, Credit Lyonnais, and the Japanese company Nomura. During Giuliani's tenure at the Department of Justice in the 1980s, Kamal Adham and other high-level Saudis behind BCCI were allowed to gain control of several American financial institutions. BCCI was subsequently allowed to continue funding terrorism without being prosecuted for many years. Giuliani remained in the U.S. Attorney position until 1989, resigning at the end of the Reagan administration. He then joined the law firm White and Case in New York as a partner. While working at White and Case, Giuliani ran for mayor of New York City in the 1989 election. In a failed campaign, it was revealed that Giuliani's firm represented the Panamanian dictator and colleague of President George H.W. Bush, Manuel Noriega. Author Russ Baker wrote that Bush, as Ford's CIA director and then as Reagan's vice president, had fostered a relationship with the notorious drug trafficker during the 70s and 80s, even keeping him on the payroll at more than $100,000 a year. Giuliani's reaction to the revelation that his firm represented Noriega was to claim ignorance of the fact, which brought derision down upon him. Incumbent Mayor Ed Koch remarked, "Obviously you're vulnerable when you're receiving income from a firm that's lobbying for a company that's perceived as damaging our civilization. You can get rich or you can get elected." At the time, White and Case also had an office in Saudi Arabia. What is less well reported is that Giuliani's firm represented not only Noriega but also BCCI, which was funded by powerful royals in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This should be of concern considering that BCCI was the mother and father of terrorist financing operations. Another fact of concern is that Giuliani's reputation for being tough on crime was a false front. He actually did such a poor job in these prosecutions that many of his major convictions were later overturned. The question of whether he was purposely placed in that position to undermine such cases and thereby provide a door out for some of the accused must be considered. His primary activities at that time included publicly handcuffing mob bosses and business leaders on trumped-up charges, only to quietly drop the charges later, demonstrating that for his own part, Rudy was in it for the publicity. Nonetheless, with detailed knowledge of the terrorist funding bank BCCI, it is remarkable that Giuliani never mentioned terrorism as an issue on his second campaign for New York City mayor in 1993. In fact, he barely mentioned the 1993 World Trade Center bombings that had occurred earlier that year. For someone who had made a career both before 1993 and after 9/11 as a terrorist fighter, it was inexplicable that Giuliani would never talk about terrorism when running for his first elected office. Some might have said that it was a relationship with BCCI and questions that might arise about it that kept him quiet. Considering that Al-Qaeda and 9/11 are commonly seen as direct outgrowths and evolution of BCCI intelligence operations, Giuliani's link to that network is enough to justify investigating his possible role in the attacks. And then the book goes on to talk about foreknowledge. And this is a very interesting section from the book. In a televised interview with ABC News immediately after the 9/11 attacks, Rudy Giuliani stated that he was told that the World Trade Center towers were going to collapse before they actually did. This is what he said of the warning, which occurred shortly before the first tower fell. Let me just say that again. Rudy Giuliani had knowledge that the towers were going to fall before either tower fell. He says, "I went down to the scene and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management. And we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10 to 15 minutes and finally found an exit, got out, walked north, and took a lot of people with us." And this may seem obvious, but Kevin Ryan points out that problems with this remark include that at that time, no one familiar with structural fires or tall buildings ever expected anything of this kind. That is because no tall building had ever suffered global collapse from fire before, and moreover, none have experienced such a failure since that day. In the same interview, Giuliani claimed that no one had ever predicted airliner crashes into the World Trade Center, saying, "Oh, there's no question we were all totally off balance. No one could possibly expect large airplanes to crash into the World Trade Center the way that this happened." This stammering statement was not just unconvincing, it was patently false. Those in charge of securing the WTC in the decade before 9/11, specifically Brian Michael Jenkins of Kroll Associates, had considered exactly that scenario. Another person who worked with Jenkins at Kroll Associates was James R. Buckham, once a senior advisor to Louis Freeh. Buckham had worked with Giuliani and Freeh in the offices of SDNY during that time that Giuliani was investigating BCCI. On 9/11, staff of Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management also had foreknowledge about the collapse of the buildings, and they warned some people. This was reported by Richard Zerillo, an emergency medical technician at the scene, when he said, "OEM says the buildings are going to collapse. We need to get out." And I was just at the OEM. The message I was given that the buildings are going to collapse. We need to get our people out. Fire Department Captain Abu Namud was with Zerillo just before they were warned, and both had been told to make the OEM functional in WTC Building 7. But Namad reported, "Moments thereafter, we were advised by the staff at OEM that we were to vacate the building, and they believed there was another possible plane on its way, and we proceeded to down the stairwell of World Trade Center 7 all the way down to the ground floor." In the lobby of Building 7, Zerillo and Namud apparently met with Division's Chief John Perugia, OEM Deputy Director Richard Rotanz, and an unidentified representative from the City Department of Buildings. Perugia later said that it was brought to my attention it was believed that the structural damage that was suffered to the towers was quite significant, and they were very confident that the building's stability was compromised, and they felt the North Tower was in danger of falling. So apparently and this is something that Kevin Ryan brings up in his book, that Rudy Giuliani might have gotten this information from a guy named Richard Rotanz, was later said to be the one behind the claim that a third plane was headed toward New York. Rotanz reportedly got that information from a Secret Service agent who was with him in WTC-7 at the time, and spread one information to OEM leadership. Therefore, Rotanz was actually behind two important claims that morning. And this is something that Kevin doesn't explain fully in his book, but the reason why one of these claims is important, that the third hijacked plane was headed for New York, is because apparently that was, and this is Kevin Ryan says, presumably this was the reason why the OEM Emergency Center was closed down before either tower fell. So that because of this false information that another plane was headed to New York, that's why they got out of the OEM Command Center. The second claim was that the towers were in danger of imminent collapse. In any case, this is an incredible statement, that they felt that the North Tower was in danger of a near imminent collapse, considering that no building had ever suffered global collapse from fire. Zerillo learned just how incredible this information was when he tried to spread the word to the fire chiefs in other areas, none of whom had predicted any such danger. When Zerillo told Police Chief Peter Gansey about Perugia's startling news, Gansey's response was, "Who the fuck told you that?" While Zerillo was trying to warn people, Giuliani and his police commissioner Bernard Kerik were wandering around the WTC site after the planes had hit the towers. Fire Marshal Stephen Moselio stated, "At that point the mayor shows up. I was standing away from the command post and the mayor showed up. I remember the mayor being with Commissioner Kerik and himself, a lot of their aides and escorts or whatever." By the time the South Tower did fall, Giuliani and Kerik had already moved away from immediate danger, and they were walking. They coincidentally happened upon a TV reporter who had, just the year before, published a flattering biography of Giuliani called Rudy Giuliani, Emperor of the City. This supposedly coincidental meeting is what led Giuliani being portrayed as the heroic leader of the response to 9/11 through a series of walking press conferences on that day. Fire Chief Joseph Pfeiffer, who was the command post in the lobby of the North Tower, testified that, "Right before the South Tower collapsed, I noticed a lot of people just left the lobby, and I had heard a crew of all different people, high-level people in government. Everybody was gone, almost like they had information that we didn't have." Who were these high-level people in government gathering in the lobby of the North Tower that had information others did not have? This group reportedly included Richard Schurrier, the director of the OEM. It was said that he's the guy Giuliani calls the man behind the curtain. Others suggested, since September 11th, Schurrier has taken charge of the biggest cleanup effort in American history. Whether or not he helped with the cleanup, Schurrier did have significant responsibility in his role of director at the OEM, having at various times briefed President Bush, Tony Blair, and Henry Kissinger. So, just an example. I mean, I'll just sum up the rest of this because it's a lot more to read. But this guy Schurrier, who was in charge of the actual OEM command, was inexplicably in the North Tower lobby just waiting there while they were actually technically supposed to be in the command center. The 9/11 Commission report actually wrote a 9/11 commissioner was actually very critical of Schurrier's role and says, "We, the 9/11 Commission, tried to get a sense of what Schurrier was really doing. We tried to figure out if it was out. We tried to figure it out from the videos. We couldn't tell. Everybody from OEM was with him, virtually the whole chain of command. Some of them should have been at the command center." Well, that's the very point, isn't it? The reason they built this WTC command center was to coordinate all these emergency response things from a fortified bunker in World Trade Center Building 7. But because this guy, Richard Ratones, actually spread around the rumor that a plane was headed towards that area again, that's why they got out. That's the official reason from what we know of why they got out there. But then the book goes into some really interesting stuff about the destruction of the World Trade Center crime scene evidence and how Giuliani could have prevented that from happening. And apparently the FBI, the NTSB, no government agency made sure to step in and prevent him from conducting a massively fast and controlled cleanup operation. Inexplicably very fast. Some of the steel was untraceable and was dumped and sent to scrap yards by companies connected to the mob. It was actually, and apparently Rudy Giuliani made this decision. You know, this would have involved the decisions of several entities. So a federal agency could have stepped in and been like, look, we're going to send in feds here to protect this crime scene, make sure that you don't destroy it, etc. Then it would have been on Rudy Giuliani's lap to make sure that he didn't fuck up and intervene and do something there. But he was never instructed to protect that. So that's a very fascinating thing. This is a guy who used to be a district attorney, a prosecutor, who understands the value of forensic evidence and crime scenes, just willy-nilly distributing all this scrap steel to all these different entities at a very cheap price, too. Apparently, $9 million less they would have made at the rate that Giuliani allowed this scrap to be sold for to scrap yards. The going rate for steel in total, the amount of steel that was actually sent to scrap yards and the amount that all these different entities paid for the scrap steel would have been $9 million more than what they were paid. That's just strange in and of itself. It almost seems like whoever wanted to get this, steel out of there did it at a cheap rate so that it could just happen really quickly and then no one would ask questions. Bernard Kerik, who was Giuliani's fire chief, or sorry, not fire chief. I'm sorry, give me a second here. Bernard Kerik was the police commissioner. He was under Giuliani. And he also worked with Giuliani at Giuliani Partners, Giuliani's side business, his private law firm. And what's bizarre is Bernard Kerik was the first person to go on television besides, I'm forgetting his name now. He's actually one of the other guys who was involved in the command bunker, the OEM building. Bernard Kerik at a press conference was asked by reporters how the buildings fell. Were there bombs in there? And Kerik seemed to be able to just recite the NIST's official conclusions before any actual investigation was completed about the pancake collapse and how the top floors crushed the lower floors. It's very odd that Bernard Kerik was already able to rationalize and explain that on the day of 9/11 at this press conference. Now, what's interesting about him is he appears to have been rewarded for his service when he was given the post to work directly under Paul Bremer, the Iraqi governor, the U.S. occupying governor at the time, to train the Iraqi police forces. Donald Rumsfeld used to praise him regularly. It is an odd trajectory for someone going from police commissioner to working on the ground in Iraq, training Iraqi police under Paul Bremer. Very, very strange. But what happened later is Bernard Kerik is one of these only 9/11 players or people who are involved in this whole narrative who actually went to jail later on for... Let me just make sure I get this right. So Kevin Ryan goes on to say, Kerik's connections to the mob were not a surprise to many people because he was regularly embroiled in scandal. And later he went to jail. Bribery, tax fraud, and document falsification are only some of the crimes for which Kerik was accused. Finally, in October 2009, Kerik was sent to federal prison after a judge revoked his $500,000 bail and berated him publicly from the bench. The judge described Kerik as a toxic combination of self-minded focus and arrogance. So, I think that a lot of the things Kevin brings up in this book is very compelling, and they can take you on many different branches and areas of research. For example, Rudy Giuliani's suspicious behavior, seemingly his foreknowledge, the foreknowledge of other people that worked under him, his history of being a player for the deep state, being connected to CIA operations, drug runners, Manuel Noriega, the BCCI, and just learning all that stuff about Rudy Giuliani got me sort of pointed in the direction of his anthrax cleanup company, Bio-1. So not only was Rudy Giuliani responsible for destroying the evidence of the 9/11 crime scene, he was also responsible for destroying evidence in technically the first anthrax crime scene at the AMI building in Florida that owned the National Enquirer newspaper. That's also another strange little connection there to Trump, is the AMI company is very close to Donald Trump. In fact, it's one of the only media organizations that Trump is able to plant stories in. I'm talking about before he became president. I'm sure that's changed now that he's president. But that Trump was planting stories in the National Enquirer via his connection to the owners of AMI. So there's a whole rabbit hole to go down with Rudy Giuliani and anthrax. And I'm going to be discussing that in my October 5th special anthrax episode of Media Roots Radio. So I think I'm going to probably wrap it up for now. And I'll answer some final questions if anybody had any questions they want to ask now. I wasn't paying attention to the chat, so if you want to ask me any questions before I sign off here, please put them in now. So, Charlie Brown, I think that you might be incorrect about Ehud Barak being the first person to mention bin Laden. It might have been, it might have been on American TV first, either by Paul Bremer or, and I can't remember his name right now. He's the guy who is in charge of the design of and responsible for, along with Rudy Giuliani, building the OEM command bunker. There's still, I guess there's people misinterpreting what I said about Israel having an influence over American policy. I didn't say that Israel doesn't have an influence over American policy. I just believe that primarily Israel doesn't control us. I mean, I think America has definitely a mutually beneficial relationship with us, but I don't subscribe to the idea that America is beholden to Israel at all. I hope that clarifies things for you. But I think that the person saying all this stuff about Israel just wants to talk only about Israel. So, someone's asking me to debate somebody. I'm not interested. But, I don't usually debate people on these video chats. Someone says I don't address Israel, even though I talked about it extensively earlier in the broadcast. I talked about the Amdocs 4-part Fox News series, so I'm not sure. This is, again, I don't know who this person is, but it appears that it's sort of this dogma where if you don't talk about things enough or talk about, things in a specific way, apparently I'm not addressing it, even though it's fully addressed earlier in the podcast. Someone's asking why I'm not debating somebody. I thought you were about truth. Yeah, I am about truth. I don't see why having to debate somebody who's harassed me online. And I would say it has fallen under the category of harassment. It wasn't just, normal disagreements back and forth. I mean, I already know who that guy is. I'm not interested in debating him. I'll debate someone who's, polite and who doesn't have like a history acting like that. If you talked about it on any of the previous episodes of the podcast, but any thoughts on P-TECH? Refresh my memory on what that is. I don't think I can speak on P-TECH because I'm not sure what exactly it is. Let's see. Yeah, I haven't looked into that. I'd have to look into P-TECH. I mean, I know about some of these other fronts, but not that one specifically. Doesn't ring a bell. I agree with Norman Corner here. I mean, I think my real view is a little more nuanced. But I generally agree with your comment here. Norman says, I agree with your analysis on the fundamental relationship of the U.S. empire and its satellite Israel, but there are episodes when the Israeli lobby does have disproportionate influence on U.S. foreign policy. Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, it's not all one way. There's definitely aspects where Israeli government officials and people and lobbyists have obviously influence our political landscape. I mean, there's far more evidence that the Israeli lobby has meddled in our country than Russia or really any other country at all. Oh yeah, I think Norman Corner is totally right. I mean, a lot of countries had foreknowledge of 9/11, including the United States, elements of the Israeli government, even the Russian government appeared to have foreknowledge of 9/11. And if we're talking about foreknowledge, I mean, I guess it covers the wider spectrum of warnings leading up to 9/11 and stuff like that. I mean, there were other government agencies sending the Bush administration warnings weeks and months before 9/11, saying that an attack was imminent. There's Al Qaeda people training for this, etc. So, excuse me. Terrorsaur 1 says things that have long been suspected now confirmed, like the Contra CIA connection. Nobody cares. I'm afraid 9/11 might become like this. Thoughts? Terrorsaur, I mean, unfortunately, I think your fear is justified because, I mean, it's been so long since the attacks. I don't know what would come out that would actually like drastically shift things now, unless like a Bush official or something like blew the whistle on who was really behind it and what really happened. I mean, and short of something like that, I think your fear is totally justified. And I hate to be, a cynic about it, but my fear is the next false flag, says Joseph Ballin. Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you. It seems like we're sort of overdue for some kind of major event of some kind. I was really concerned that somebody was going to try to do something to blame ISIS, for some major thing in the United States. That hasn't really happened yet. And yeah, I wouldn't put anything past the Trump administration or the U.S. government. I mean, let's just put it that way. Norman Corner says the Skripals is sort of the next false flag. That definitely falls in that wheelhouse for me. That's one of the most glaring examples of something I've seen that appeared to be a false flag attack that's happened recently. David Wint says, is there any evidence that Rudy Giuliani respects Wood? No, I don't think he does respect Wood at all. I think that's been pretty clear. If he doesn't respect the 9/11 crime scene and the human remains, then no fucking doubt in my mind that motherfucker doesn't respect Wood. Yeah, David, when it comes to that stuff about like the white helmets staging chemical attacks or the rebels staging chemical attacks, I'm hesitant to latch on to even those counter narratives because I guess I find it very hard personally to relate to almost anybody on my view on Syria. And I guess just really quickly, just an example is I'm kind of disgusted that everywhere I see leftists calling people jihadis and jihadist. I mean, I frankly don't think the term jihad should be ever cast in a negative light. I mean, I guess that's how resistant I am to like sort of the post 9/11 Islamophobia, that it makes me cringe when I see people that I would consider colleagues on the anti-imperialist left referring to anybody as a head chopper, a jihadi, Islamo-fascist. I mean, it sounds like the kind of stuff you would hear on right-wing talk radio during the Bush administration, and I very much do not appreciate it. And I think that it's really, frankly, disgusting that I see anti-imperialist leftists focusing more on the level of religious fundamentalism that rebels are versus the fact that they're CIA funded. I mean, what is the real problem here? They were funding Islamic fundamentalists to try to take out Assad, or that we're funding anybody to take out Assad? It's kind of, to me, the more important thing is that the U.S. government and other entities are funding a proxy war in Syria using any type of fighters they can get. So what happens is, if leftists are seemingly okay with groups like the YPG in Syria because the YPG was fighting ISIS and not Assad and all this stuff. And it's like, well, the YPG is funded by the Pentagon and were previously funded by the CIA. So I'm just not, I guess I just don't understand why it's always about the level of jihadi they are. I mean, I think that really is a very poor realm to argue the Syrian war in. Because I think that it really boils down to, do you want the U.S. to be waging a proxy war against Assad and Syria or not? And if you don't, then you shouldn't support any rebel, even if they were the most secular, fucking anarchist rebel ever, who's like wears like like Antifa armband or something. Like I don't give a shit. If you're taking CIA money to wage a proxy war on behalf of the U.S. empire, fuck you. Joseph Ballin says, but aren't they CIA funded because they are fundamentalists? No. I mean, I think that's proven incorrect with all the different groups that the CIA and Pentagon have been funding. We do all stripes. God, I guess it's really frustrating to me that this all people want to talk about is how all roads go back to Israel. I don't know who's in this chat, AEM. It's just every single comment he left is how everything's this Israeli front. The YPG Kurds are allied with Israel. Do a Google search. He says, I guess I just widen your research field a little more. I just don't understand the fixation of why it's all about Mossad and Israel for some people. And why you can't just incorporate other things into that. It's a very weird kind of tunnel vision. But, whatever floats your boat, if that's what you want to do. It's not what I do. Some guy named Charlie Brown is just talking about BB again. Okay, I guess it's a good time to end the chat now. So thanks for joining me today, everybody. And if you want to support Media Roots Radio, we have a Patreon page at patreon.com/Media Roots Radio. And you can follow me on Twitter at Fluorescent Gray. And I still have copies of A Very Heavy Agenda for sale. Are running low on stock. We might get them repressed. I'd say I probably have about 75 copies left of each part. So you can get that at averyheavyagenda.com. I'm trying to think if there's any other information I need to give out. Check out John Gold's new book, We Were Lied to About 9/11. It doesn't just have one point of view on 9/11. It has dozens and dozens of very different points of view, from Colleen Rowley to Paul Thompson to Phil Shannon to Bob McIlvaine, who had his son was killed in the World Trade Center. So highly recommend it. Recommend checking out Ray Novoselsky and John Duffy's new book, The Watchdogs Didn't Bark. It's sort of incorporating and building off of all of their previous work, including 9/11 Press for Truth and Who is Rich Blee podcast. And yeah, new Empire Files episodes will be coming out now that Abby has gotten some crowdfunding for that because her funding was cut off due to U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. So yeah, all that's very exciting. Stay tuned for that. You could follow her at Abby Martin. And yeah, thank you everybody for listening. I'll try to do this again with a little better preparation next time. Oh, Norman Corner. The book is called The Watchdogs Didn't Bark. All right, thanks everybody. Peace.